So my name is Rusty Carter. I run the website, thewealthyironworker.com, and the podcast that is an extension of the website, not the other way around, which is usually the case for a lot of podcasters. So I've been an iron worker, a union iron worker here in the States for 24 years now. And through that time frame, how the website got started about 8 years ago next month was various subjects and whatnot. And I like to do a lot of research, I like to read and write, and clearly podcast now, but I like to do a lot of those things. And I come to find out that a lot of things that I was actively looking for, I could find a lot of perspective from and for and or to in a white collar environment. But there was a lot that seemed to be just missing, quite frankly, that spoke to those individuals who are in the trades, who are skilled men and women who, there were resources that I felt like they just don't exist at all. They weren't out there. And far be it from me to think that I could completely plug that, fill that hole, but I've attempted to. There's a lot of flair that I write from that seems to be very intentionally focused on the trades and from that perspective. And so a lot of the content is created or geared towards that, taking the jelly and putting it on the bottom shelf, if you will, and exploring uh, larger macro concepts like economics or leadership and personal development, all this other stuff that there's a lot of stuff that's talked about around the water cooler, but out on the job site, not as much. There's not that many resources. So that's how it got started. And just like anything else, things morph into a lot more than what they initially plan to. You follow in the trajectory and whatever, kind of gets created and whatnot into the space. So that's a brief introduction. I mean, there's a whole lot more that I'm sure that we'll get into as we, kind of begin our topical discussions.
Hello, I'm John Cuturilo from Melbourne, Australia. I own and operate Your Listener Counselling, host the Your Listener podcast, and write regularly and speak regularly on radio about psychology. I have a history of working with a broad range of clients and presentations with particular interests in trauma, relational concerns, and habits. I also have experienced mental illnesses myself, and I combine theoretical knowledge and evidence-based methods with the wisdom gained from my own and clients' experiences to form an approach which is adaptable, person-centered, and authentic. On my podcasts, I discuss psychology, critical thinking, and social affairs in a unique manner. I eschew politics, rhetoric, and lecturing on what to believe, and instead encourage my audience to be more critical and curious consumers of information. I also advocate helping them to develop more detailed, complex knowledge rather than overly simplifying concepts to the extent that they become empty slogans. I particularly welcome collaboration with people who have perspectives which radically differ from mine. Welcome to this collaboration between the Wealthy Ironworker Podcast and the Your Listener Podcast. Before we get started into today's discussion, I want to remind our audience that nothing that you find on the internet or in the media is advice. If you have concerns about yourself or anyone else for any reason of any nature, please seek advice from a professional or someone else that you trust. In today's episode, we're going to be undertaking a nuanced analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of different economic structures, socialism, capitalism, and the related politics of it. Now, what we want to make clear from the start is that this is not an ideologically based or argumentative discussion, and we're not suggesting that anyone who identifies as a socialist or a capitalist or in any economic identity is inherently a good or bad person. So these are not value judgments about the people that may hold these particular theories to be true. What we're also not trying to do here is make arguments about what true capitalism or true socialism is. There is quite a few arguments that are in popular culture that if a theory or something that states to be of a particular theory, for example, an economy that states to be capitalist or states to be socialist, has weaknesses, people say, well, that's not true capitalism or it's not true socialism. There's often a difference between what something is in theory and how it actually manifests in real life. So what we're going to
That's
do is
right.
try to make an objective analysis of the consequences, positive and negative, and the psychology of different economic structures.
I don't remember when I was younger, the economic discussion being so heated as it is today. And there's a reason for that. There's numerous reasons for that. I think it's because in a large part, there's a lot of people who are not represented or are not represented well in the economic calculus of today.
Absolutely. And from there, it already segues into some of the potential disadvantages of taking a particular theory such as capitalism too literally, or taking it as the only working system, as you've mentioned previously. It also demonstrates some of the disadvantages of the bias thinking that can happen when you think in categories. For example, if you think that a theory can constitute an entire working system, then your mind, due to a phenomenon known as cognitive dissonance, in which existing information, you use it to try to make the world look consistent and can make your thoughts and your actions consistent with one another in order to maintain an illusion that the world is an orderly place. Then if you already think in terms of the category, then you're already trying to make everything else that you perceive in the world make sense in light of that. So even when looking at what are quite clearly disadvantages of a particular economic system, your mind may find a way to justify that they are actually beneficial, even if they're clearly not, because your mind is trying to make sense of a complicated world using rigid categories. We tend to choose our behaviors based on existing preconceived notions and how we relate to ideas that already exist. So if there is a reason why, if something is consistently manifesting in a particular way, then all the people who are involved in that manifestation, whether it be consciously or unconsciously, are being attracted to it for a reason. Maybe the reasons are valid, maybe they're inaccurate, but at the same time, there's a reason that they're being attracted to it. So if it manifests that way, there's a likelihood that there was some intentionality for it to be that way. Maybe it's not even by the majority of people involved, but there's likely to be some intentionality behind it. It would be helpful for us to have working definitions of these different economic arrangements, because different people have different interpretations of them and they make arguments about what is or isn't true capitalism or socialism. But there are two different arguments. You could say that there is a spirit, or what something is intended to be, that never actualizes. Or on the other side, you could say that if something constantly manifests the same way, you could effectively argue that that's what it is, because there must be a reason why it's happening that way. Would you say that the most literal or basic definition of capitalism is an economic arrangement in which there is free trade, where individuals are free to start businesses, they're free to choose the model in terms of pricing, their scaling, the terms of their employment contracts, how they interact with other key stakeholders, and that it is essentially theorized to be completely voluntary, and that if you don't like how another person in the market is operating, or another entity in the market is operating, you have the voluntary right to depart from that and interact with somebody else who is willing to interact on your terms. And the idea being that if every person has the right to voluntarily enter into and exit from business agreements and business interactions, then eventually the market will stabilize itself, because the market will see what people respond well to and what they don't respond well to, and gravitate towards that which people tend to find beneficial and tend to want to approach. Might that be a literal definition, barring any intentional or implied aspects of it?
Yeah, that's a good working definition, I think, from a theory and a initial implication or initial, uh, let's say, application of it. Interestingly enough, one of the podcast episodes I just got done doing was 4 books that you need in your library, and one of them, Peter Georgescu, was a self-professed capitalist. The opening line of that book says, "Capitalism has been committing suicide slowly for 4 decades." And I think he's absolutely 100% right. And it's all, I don't want to say all, but it's in large part following the economic formula. The only thing that a company has to do, the only social responsibility, if you will, is to make money. And when you have governments that are co-opted by, when when the regulators are captured, if you will, when they are regulated, what you see is an economic model that devolves from what we had in post World War II to what we have now, which is largely a form of corporatism, where you have corporate welfare and low taxes that are advocated, and wage stagnation, which is why when this economic model that we're under today has morphed into what it's morphed into under the propaganda that free trade or free market capitalism actually exists, and it works for less and less people. This is why the interest is so high for, let's say, more interesting for socialism. I would say that if you want the truth about it, I would say that true free market capitalism was exactly a lot closer to the Industrial Revolution and the robber baron era of America than it certainly was or is post World War II. I would say that we're slowly, unfortunately, getting back to where you have this quote unquote free market, which doesn't exist anyway. It never does. Anytime you put any kind of regulation in the market at all. And you mentioned earlier in the, let's say, implied definition of capitalism, or from the political libertarian perspective, less regulation. The problem with that, this is where capitalism goes off the rails. But quite frankly, this is also where socialism goes off the rails, because you have inherent is the human element of this. This is the major problem with any economic model, is that the human being in general, that's our human nature. With capitalism, we're worshiping capital. That's what we're doing in large part. I don't want to smear capitalism too much, because I happen to agree with Peter Drucker. I think that capitalism is the only thing that works, but I have serious reservations about it because it's very one dimensional. It's very, economics is the end all be all, when there's so much more that makes you who you are and me who I am and everybody else. And that is one of the major issues that people have, rightly so, with capitalism. But nonetheless, the political perspective that you mentioned certainly bears out. And if we want to see what capitalism looks like, we have a historical reference, and it's not that far back to go when we have very little regulation. We have, quite frankly, an economic model where people were paid in company script and worked for pennies on the dollar is the idiom. And they shopped in company stores, and you worked 12 hours a day for 7 days a week, and your kids worked. And I mean, there's a whole litany of things that you want a real true picture. And this is going back to where you were like, oh, people say, well, that wasn't capitalism or true cap. Look, however a thing manifests, right? If it manifests over and over again, and if we look at it, I would say that that is the actual true 100% complete picture. I said that I'm going to work for $2 a day. Well, this guy is willing to put his 5-year old kid in there and to work for $1 a day. That's free market capitalism in the theory, in a nutshell, when it comes down to it. So the grand scheme of things, really, when it comes to the regulational political aspect of it, is what does it mean to be a human being? And what does it mean to, from a government perspective, what does it mean to do right by the actual your constituency, the populace of the entire country, and not just what it means for a market, not just what it means for an economic model. And that's where we're wrestling. That's where the discussion needs to be. Well, it is being had, but that's where it needs to be opened up larger. And that's why I'm so grateful to be able to have podcast episodes like this one right here with other individuals who are also interested in exploring the ramifications of worshiping capital, the ramifications of forgetting what it means to be a human being, the ramifications of what is we're not one dimensional. We're not, purely economical. We're not, there's so much more than what that means. And so this is a good conversation. And I think that from a political perspective, we need to have these conversations a lot more.
There are, however, some implied associated ideas. For example, one of them is that wealth can be self-justifying, in the sense that if you can make money from doing something, a particular activity, and somebody else is willing to pay for it, then that in itself is worth doing. It does tend to be associated with the politics of libertarianism, which is the idea that there should be as few possible regulations on how society and the economy operates at a governmental level, as long as some basic morals are respected. That tends to be associated with government policies like lowering taxes, having fewer, at least centralized government powers, having fewer laws and regulations. It tends to refer to, if I'm not misinterpreting it, in a sense, a type of evolutionary theory, in which is to say life is by nature a challenge. There's no way to avoid the challenge. So the best way to help people work with that challenge, or the best way to run a society, is to effectively allow people to approach the challenge. That those who have the strength to survive will find a way to adapt and survive. Those that don't will, quite grimly, to be honest with you, if people think this way about other humans, they will be removed from the gene pool, so to speak, and the rest will continue. That, and if we take it literally, that's perhaps how libertarianism and very rigid capitalism could be interpreted in many ways. On the flip side, how do we define socialism? This is difficult because there's a lot of disagreement about what socialism actually is. So,
Mm.
in a literal sense, we could say that socialism is an economic arrangement in which the markets and governance in which society operates are collectively owned. People own the resources for conducting business, premises, natural resources, equipment, and so forth. People collectively govern, meaning that every person has the right to contribute to deciding how society is to operate. The norms, especially what those aspects of how we function that are implied and not often spoken, they get to be decided collectively and with greater consideration to the fairness to each individual, especially vulnerable individuals who may not have the same power as others. And that also that the outcomes of people's efforts and labor, for example, the direct wealth that comes from earning a living, and also the outcomes of what people actually produce, the products and services and so forth, should be redistributed so that each person receives not what they're able to earn on their own, but what they need, so that people who are
Mm.
not able to earn much for themselves, especially what they need, they're able to receive it, and it's not inadvertently or unfairly skewed towards just the people who are rich enough or powerful enough to be able to afford it. And the spirit being that it's meant to combat discrimination so that vulnerable individuals aren't disadvantaged because they're vulnerable.
From a theoretical perspective, I would say that you're pretty close to what I experience whenever I either read about it or if I have additional conversations with individuals who are nuanced enough to converse with it. Um, Socialism sounds very similar, at least in the definition, the theory definition that we just discussed. Socialism seems to be what I'll say is it's something that's touted quite regularly. It's something that is dismissed outright from pure, born out of capitalism. Those individuals, there's a lot of individuals that dismiss it outright. Number one, I would say it's because it's dismissed certainly by those that would be affected the most, which are the wealthy, the rich, and the powerful. They do, uh, I'm reminded of a quote from Rockefeller: "How much is enough? Just a little bit more. Just a little bit more." We're worshiping capital, so we're worshiping greed. Is effectively what we're doing. And so those individuals denounce it, but there's a whole list of people that fall for a lot of propaganda. And so those individuals, or propagandized in general, those individuals also resist it. And it's also telling, I'm also reminded of a quote from Mark Twain that said, "It's easier to fool a man than it is to convince him that he's been fooled." And this idea that if you really want to mess with somebody that is so propagandized to some degree, I don't know how it is in Australia, but in America, the police force and the firefighters, that's a very socialistic concept. That is not a capitalistic endeavor at all. That is a very socialistic for the common good, if you will. And so I think the real conversation to build on the theoretical definition of capitalism, and to build on the theoretical definition of socialism, is where do we meet in the middle? Where do we come to some form of an agreement where we find an economic model that works, but that doesn't just work for a select few people, but that works for the maximum uh, the maximum number of citizenry to really unleash the economic, to unleash the wealth of a nation. The wealth of a nation from Joseph Stiglitz's People, Power, and Profits book was the wealth of a nation is the power of the people and what they can create. It's not the it's not a model that works for a few people. It's the it's what the people can release. And if they're working and trying to function under a model that seems to really heavily benefit a small minority of people, then we have a serious problem governmentally. And the problem that, at least in my mind anyway, is that when we start to deviate, when we start to get to where we're at now, where we're like, capitalism has been slowly committing suicide for 4 decades because it's following the intent, like really rabid intent. Now you're giving power. The more power that a government has, it can be a very slippery slope, because almost exclusively from a socialistic perspective, it devolves into communism. It has a very real possibility of doing that. And when it does that, it never comes out good. It's one of those things where it's manifested multiple times. This is, quite frankly, packaged. Here it is. This is what happens ultimately over and over and over again. And so the real goal is to find out. I'll tell you, let me say it this way and see if it resonates with you. I was listening to, I don't know if you know who Brett Weinstein is. Brett Weinstein is a evolutionary biologist, and I don't pay much attention to that stuff. But he was talking to Joe Rogan, and he made a comment that has stuck with me for days. He said, the stinginess of the right produces the communistic impulses of the left. And that statement right there has been stuck in my mind for weeks now, quite frankly. And I thought to myself, well, it's certainly true. But what has kept the communistic impulses at bay in our own in our own economic model? And the only real definition that I can come up with, only real answer, is unionism. Unionism is the only thing that I can think that has pumped the brakes to a degree of this march towards devolving capitalism to where it probably would be, if we had a complete, utter, just outright, you know, economic and cultural revolution. And this is why I can confidently say that what we've got is a economic model worship, because that's, if labor doesn't matter, it's all about capital. Labor doesn't matter. Labor matters because labor enables you to meet and reach capital. And this conversation that is, well, quite frankly, it needs to happen, but is ongoing. Is going to take a. I will be very interested to see what governments do with AI, because the market will tell you that the market will tell you that the market solves problems. The market does solve problems, but the market also creates problems, and the market is not incentivized to solve the problems that it creates. And massive unemployment is what's ultimately, I think, going to take place when it comes to AI, because AI is going to really call into question, and it's going to really create this divide between an economic model and what serves the bulk of the citizenry of any country, whether it's Australia or any country in Western, Eastern Europe, Asia, North America, whatever it happens to be. If you've got an economic model that is only working for a few and you've got systemic unemployment, I will be very interested to see how the conversation shifts, because it can't stay the same. There's no way it can stay the same. We do have the haves and the have-nots, but the income inequality gulf is going to continue to skyrocket, and you can't. That's unsustainable for a democracy. It just is, and so I'll be very interested to see what happens, and what kind of conversations are born out from a economic model, governmental perspective, and just how markets are going to embrace AI. And they're going to be, I mean, we've already seen it. There's already layoffs that are taking place. So it's going to enter into okay, well, what does it really mean to be a human being? And is the worship of capital the only thing? Is that the only thing that we need to be interested in? I think that's the danger. That's one of the real significant dangers of capitalism, is that it's very one dimensional, and it has the power when 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 followed to the logical conclusion to exploit or to just rule your entire life through economics. And that's not, is if you ask me, that's not exactly what we should be looking and focusing on. So
Absolutely. I would almost say in a pure form, it can be animalistic. It assumes that people just function autonomously. They don't have feelings. They don't have higher needs that other species of animal don't have. It's a case of if you just blindly conform and be emotionless, you will be fine, which is a lie. But
yeah, yep,
to that extent, ultimately, we cannot be wiser than Mother Nature. And regardless of what theories we invent, or regardless of what we believe is going to work, ultimately, the natural cycles and the natural law on which human beings operate, both physically and psychologically, is always going to prevail. And if we try to work against it, then nature is going to resist. And eventually, that's going to cause problems. So it's all well and good for a capitalist, a pure capitalist, to say, well, if somebody fell on hard times, they didn't try hard enough.
yeah,
But there are people in the world who are working ridiculously hard every day. Maybe they have families who are disabled or seriously ill. Maybe they're disabled or seriously ill. And they're working hard. Nobody wants to give them a job because nobody wants a burden on their hands in their company that's making millions for the people who aren't a burden, so to speak. And no one wants to no one wants to be compassionate to their particular needs. They haven't done anything wrong. It's not their fault that they're in that position. But if there's a lack of regulation that allows that person to be able to survive to meet their basic needs, then all the capitalism in the world or all the theorizing in the world is not going to make that person's needs disappear, and it's not going to make the situation easier. There are other arguments that are sometimes made which are fallacious, which will certainly address. But if the essence of being human is our power to construct, both individually and collectively, so if nature designed us that way, that means we can make use of that human nature to benefit ourselves and other people and have a healthy functioning society. You don't need to be a strict, you don't have to follow a strict theoretical regime. You can follow what evidently manifests in the real world. You can follow people's natural inclinations to construct and nurture them, and through that you will develop, and you in hopefully, when if everyone enters into it with the right intentions and in good faith and has the right competence, will create an economic system that finds a balance between what we call capitalism and what we call socialism, where people have the means to meet their needs, but they also have they're also afforded the right to keep what they earn and to reap the benefits of their own risks and their own hard work without having to unfairly disadvantage other people.
yeah. I think that this is the conversation that I think that what happens, at least from where I stand, is that people by default, the second that you critique anything, all right. So for example, if I say, okay, I've got some very serious critiques of capitalism. That's not to say I'm against capitalism. That's just to say that I have some critiques of it. First off, I'm in good company. There are other individuals who also have critiques of capitalism. Some very prominent individuals that would sit here and tell you, "Hey, Angus Deaton is an economist who was like, hey, he celebrated the declines of unions. He has since recanted that. He has since changed his mind." Peter Drucker, who is commonly referred to as the father in modern management, has said, "I've got serious reservations about capitalism because it's myopic." The second that you tweak anything, the second that you critique anything, people don't want to have that nuanced conversation, so they automatically shut you down. In the case of capitalism, they'll call you a socialist. I mean, just blanketly, "Oh, you must be a socialist." Mm, First off, what are we defining that as? But secondly, maybe if I tell you that I am pro capitalism, I'm just saying that it behooves me, if we, to what degree do we have the haves and the have nots before we go, is this the kind of society that we really want to be living in? That in out of all the first world countries, the United States is the biggest that's built on we have significantly more wealth, income, inequality than every other first world country. And that's a significant issue. But the second that you bring up, and it's like a rabid defense, you must be a socialist or you're a communist or you're a Marxist or whatever you happen to be. And it's like, no, I actually think that capitalism is a theory that works. It just sometimes it's working in a way that is very exploitative. It works in a way that the production of goods seems to be siphoned off to the extremely wealthy, and there's a whole litany of individuals that are left in the dust. And never mind the perspective that you brought up about, this person, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, or what, this person didn't try hard enough. And it's like, mm, do you have any idea what they've been through? Do you know there's a whole list of things that have come about that make their life just enormously difficult. And if the shoes were on the other foot, you go, you'd be empathetic to their situation. We just have some serious issues to think about. And the worship, I've been thinking about this for quite some time, John. And I think that the more that I contemplate economics, the more that I believe 100% that the most dogmatic individuals from a capitalistic perspective worship an economic model. That's exactly what that is. When you unfettered, it's a worship of a model, and they think that the American people or any other citizenry, you exist to support this economic model as opposed to an economic model that should exist from a governmental perspective that works for the citizenry. And I think we have our values completely backwards.
Absolutely. And it derives from what I would call a major existential dread. We know that life is complicated at an implicit level. We know that life can be difficult. We know that the world can be a threatening place, and we try to seek order and a sense of safety. One of the ways that we do that is by binding ourselves to a particular ideological model, whether it be an economic model, a
Mm,
political model, a religious model, a philosophical model.
mm.
And because we need something to which to bind ourselves in order to feel that sense of safety, if we see events in the world that then align with that model, we'll assume, well, I feel safe because I was right. This model really does work. But then
Like you're interesting.
exactly, but when something violates it or when somebody questions it at an unconscious level, we think, wait, this person just questions it. That might mean that I'm wrong, and I can't tolerate that idea because that would mean that my entire assumption of the world being an orderly place would be completely wrong, and I'd have to think about how dangerous it is. So the easiest solution is to just, as you said, shut down that person's argument without considering that the logic that you're applying, that this person that I'm applying to the situation, might actually be applied by the other person as well, and we may both have a valid argument to make. It's just that we may be arguing about different aspects of the problem, or we may have just not considered aspects of the problem that we just with which we have no first-hand experience. And if we did have that experience, as you say, if the shoe was on the other foot, our perspective could change quite rapidly.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'll tell you that it's not an ad hominem attack, but on the sly, it's an ad hominem attack because I don't want to shut you down, and I want to link you with the argument that you're making. I want to take away any focus on the substance of what you're saying and instead talk about the make it as if you are wrong and your perspectives are wrong. I don't want to give credit to or any time to the nuances that you may have to bring together, right? So I'm gonna slander you with what is a thinly veiled ad hominem attack by just saying, "Oh, you must be a socialist, or you must be a Marxist, or you must be a communist." And it's intent, right? It's twofold as far as I'm concerned. It's to divert attention from your perspective, but it's also to debase you to some degree, so that if you do actually bring up something quasi significant, well, he's a communist, so why are we paying attention to him? That it's meant as an attack. What you are doing is exactly what Peter George Skew highlighted. You're committing suicide. You're committing economic model suicide by allowing the excesses to the degree that you've got until public opinion turns against it. And what's amazing, absolutely amazing to me, is the number of political fossils who will look at young people and go, well, I can't believe that they're interested in, let's say, textbook socialism or whatever. And I'm going, well, if you live under a rock, if you can't see that, they're under enormous amounts of college debt and we have inflationary spending and I would say, artificially inflated assets, to be blunt with you. But all of these things kind of come together to make these people think, well, if this is what it's like to be under this economic model, I feel like the deck is stacked against me. I can't get ahead. This sounds even better over here. And so they give credence then to an economic model that, if worked more equitably to a lot of American citizenry, and maybe not even from the company or corporation perspective, but from a government regulation perspective, they wouldn't give credit to, or they wouldn't even pay attention to a lot of these other economic models. And so you have all these political fossils who feign ignorance, and I got to believe it's what's happening is that there's enough information out there now that the propaganda that you've been sowing for 30, 40 years, people are starting to see. It's really hard to turn a blind eye. And so it's an unfortunate discussion, but it's one that I it needs to be had. And if we don't have it, then what we're going to continually devolve into something a whole lot worse. That's for sure.
Now, on that note, let's evaluate some of the strengths and weaknesses of these different arrangements in their theoretical or absolute forms to exemplify these points that we're making, that we need a balance between the two, and a model that actually evolves out of direct responsiveness to our worth and well-being as a human race, rather than just from the theoretical models themselves. Under capitalism, as we've already stated, there are strengths that capitalist theory does have over the manifestation of a pure socialist theory. One of them, and in the course of this, we can also discuss the arguments that are made against capitalism and why they don't match the real world implementation of how our economies function. Capitalism does allow for us to reap the benefits of our own hard work and our own sacrifices. And we have to address that there is a myth that anyone who is entrepreneurial, especially small business owners or somebody who owns more than one property, for example, must be a greedy, evil person who has absolutely exploited every resource at their disposal and has inherently had to disadvantage or steal from somebody else morally to be able to obtain what they have. But the realities of business and even property ownership are not as easy as a lot of people think. Life may be easy. There are caveats to this which we'll discuss, but life may be easy for a select few people who are extremely rich, but for the majority of us who own property or own businesses, there is an incredible amount of sacrifice that we have to make just to keep those assets functioning. As I'm sure you'd know, we work long hours. We have to work longer hours than somebody who is, on average, employed by somebody else and doesn't have as many responsibilities, especially if you run a business on your own and you have to take every role under that business. Property ownership, I'm not sure how it is in the United States, but here in Australia, property ownership is quite heavily regulated with regards to how you're taxed if you sell property, with regards to the rules that you have to obey and the benefits that you have to provide a tenant if you have a rental property that you rent to somebody else. And that costs us significant money. And if you have a family, or if you have significant needs, for example, health needs that require you to spend a lot of money on yourself, there may not be much left after you've covered your expenses. Some people end up on the street or poor because their sacrifices didn't quite pay and they failed, which is always a risk. And that's what capitalism facilitates.
Well, again, going back to the stinginess of the right creates the communistic impulse to the left. We would not be, I think this lie that, first off, I'm glad you brought it up. It's not true, but it's given more merit because of the economic abuse that capitalism brings out as a whole from corporations and the like. And there have been economists who have theorized that the real only significant check in corporation power is going to be unionism. I happen to agree, but it's because so many people feel boxed out of, you know, so many people feel boxed out of the economy in general that that lie is not only has been originated, but it's also perpetuated. It's not true, but it there are significant abuses within the capitalist system that bring that lie, that give it legs, that give it feet, and allow it to to run its marathon and to continually perpetuate it. And it's unfortunate because, like you say, I mean, just my own life. We do have so my wife and I lived in a very small house for, for 13, 14 years. I lived in a house for 15 plus. When we sold it and purchased the one we're in now, our interest rate was 3.25. And we were able to buy this house without doing that. So anyway, we rent to a couple of young men that go to our church, and we could rent for a significant amount more. But me personally, I don't feel it's right for me to look another person in the eye and say, well, I'm going to strip the pound of flesh off of you every month in high exorbitant rent. I feel like as another human being, I think that you ought to be able to have discretionary spending, and you ought to be able to. So for me, I'm going, well, I can't quite just go, I want to make an exorbitant amount of money per month and participate to a large degree in rent-seeking behavior to add and perpetuate to the same thing that I'm sitting here having a robust conversation with you about, which is the abuse of the system. I don't want to perpetuate that. Yeah.
There's another aspect of capitalism that's important to integrate into the comparison with socialism, and it's the psychology of where socialism may originate and then what it may facilitate. Now, it's really important when making this analysis to understand that we're not saying that anyone is necessarily malingering. Yes, there is such thing as a malingerer in a literal sense, but I would say the majority of people who think what in the way that I'm about to describe aren't malingering. They just haven't been taught certain aspects of how their minds work, and they've been misled into believing this. Socialism comes a lot from class theory and sociological theories. It originates from the idea that society operates the way it does because people are indoctrinated and are therefore blinded to alternative explanations of how life works, into believing that who we are told to be are who we inherently are. So if you are born into a poor family, you must live in accordance with the ethos of being a poor person, not daring to speak to a rich person, not daring to aspire to anything beyond what you have. That's what nature decided for you, and that's all you're ever going to be. If you have a governor or someone governing over you, they are that way because nature intended for them to be that way. You must respect that hierarchy. If you are a rich person, well, that person deserves it, therefore their authority should be respected. And sociology strongly challenges that and says, well, these ideas are actually socially constructed in the sense that nature didn't actually invent money, didn't invent power, didn't invent status. We were created to have basic needs for sustenance, self-protection, relation with others, procreation, and shelter to protect us from nature. We then created means of trying to meet those needs more effectively as a collective than we could meet them individually. Money was one of those, evolved from that process. It became a proxy for meeting our other needs. But none of those are actually inherent in human nature. We invented them. So sociology suggests that we should question that. Now, that's actually a necessary part of life in itself until we get to the more extreme sociological theories, which state that if you are born into or if you believe yourself to be of a particular role, then you are inherently and inextricably indoctrinated. If you, for example, believe in traditional being a traditional male if you're a male, or being a traditional woman if you're a woman, then you're indoctrinated and you're completely blinded to the idea that it's socially constructed. They'll say that if you can't, it extends to arguing that if you cannot make it, if you can't have success in the world, or if you can't look after yourself, or if you have any type of failure of any sense, inherently the cause is the system. The system and the way that it is constructed is always biased so that you get disadvantaged and someone else gets advantaged. Now, again, to a certain extent, society does indoctrinate. Like social learning is a real phenomenon. Social psychology has demonstrated that we do learn irrational or false ideas, including the ideas that certain people deserve status when they really don't. The problem with this type of pure thinking, this pure sociological thinking, what tends to happen is that this thinking facilitates learned helplessness, whereby your mind actually find, without even knowing it, you are completely blinded to aspects of your life, or aspects of yourself that allow you to succeed, and aspects in which you do have choices, and aspects in which you do have control of your life, because the emotional allure of the idea that you are oppressed and that you don't have to take responsibility for your own actions in your own life is so strong, given that, again, we tend to try to seek comfort in life, and a form of comfort is avoiding the effort of personal responsibility sometimes. The emotional allure of that is so strong that your mind actually inadvertently interprets any argument to the contrary that as being wrong, or as somehow being a product of more attempts to indoctrinate you. So it's not the same. It's not the case for every person, and it's not malingering, because I would say that, again, people genuinely have not been taught this. But I've analysed a lot of sociological rhetoric, and I've also looked into the lives of many people who do align with that type of theory. And again, being a counsellor, I'm very privileged to be able to see into people's lives on a regular basis and be able to analyse how they live their lives. And of course, I'm certainly not suggesting that people deliberately cause their own problems just so they could elicit pity. Yes, some people do that, but I wouldn't say that's the majority of people. But all too often, when people take the mindset that society caused my failure or society caused my oppression, all too often their lives actually aren't as organized or as actualized as they could be, and often they're not exercising the full extent of their choices. And the argument that I always have at the end, not I certainly don't argue with clients in session, but if I listen to this type of explanation, the argument I always have is, if you have not brought all aspects of your life in order that you possibly can, if you've not taken the maximum extent of you control that you can control, how can you possibly separate the failure that you experience because of the system and the failure you experience because you haven't been taught to make the best choices? Now, again, it's not your fault. Often we're not taught to make good choices, and many people say, well, making good choices is common sense. No, actually, when you're born into the world, there's a lot you don't know inherently. You have to learn it. So I would say that, again, I'm going to be ironic and say society has probably done some people a disservice by not teaching them the maximum extent of making good choices. But what that facilitates then is not only learned helplessness, whereby your cycle of failure can self-perpetuate because you're constantly thinking about the possibility of being oppressed without the possibility of success that could happen if you do make your own choices, but it also facilitates avoidance as a coping mechanism, which psychology studies over the years have shown doesn't work. If you retreat every time a challenge comes your way, you're teaching yourself over time not to approach challenges, and you're actually weakening your own psychological resilience. If you approach challenges deliberately, yes, you're bound to fail at some stage because there's always going to be some force stronger than you, but you're also teaching yourself to be more skilled and powerful in managing the challenges themselves. Now, again, it's not the case with every socialist or person who identifies as one or who believes in socialism, and I wouldn't say it's in most cases anyone the fault of the individual. We, unfortunately, as a society, don't teach practical psychology. It's a bane of our existence, but that's what it can facilitate. And as much as it may not be anyone's fault, it's also not in our best interest that we think that way, because we don't actually do ourselves any favor. And if society functions on that basis, then what ends up happening is everyone thinks they're oppressed, nobody takes action, and then whatever problems we see just keep continuing because nobody has actually thought, hey, what if I do something differently? Maybe that will actually solve the problem that I think is actually affecting me to the extent that I can't change it.
I look at it, and that's a really actually a great analysis. From the individual, how do you balance the individual responsibility that you have? So, it could very well be that you were paid enough money. Here's an economic perspective that I try to slice through this nuance is that you're paid enough money, but through bad, poor decisions individually, you now don't have enough money to take care of the bills you have, as opposed to the individual who just doesn't make enough money. You might say, well, I don't have any free discretionary spending either. Maybe that's because you had bad choices individually. And so you have to balance that out. And I look at it as, from an easy, low hanging fruit perspective. Oh, it's a social construct. So this is the problem we've got. And it's just low hanging fruit. And I'm pretty fond of saying that you'll only solve a problem. The level with which you'll solve a problem is commensurate with how much information you have about it. If you're attacking something with low hanging fruit, don't be surprised if your surface level observations only solve surface level problems. And these aren't surface level problems. These are very nuanced. These are very painful conversations to have because now we have to address number one, the fact that a whole host of people have been fooled. And that's a very difficult thing because you can fool someone, like Mark Twain said. It's easier to fool someone than it is to convince them they've been fooled. And not only there are people on a rigorous capitalist perspective that have been fooled into thinking that this economic model is this when it's really this. It's the same thing for socialists. They are fooled into thinking that it's this thing from a theory perspective, but every time it's been implemented, it leads to communism. And communism has never come out good, ever. And so this is why these conversations need to be had because we don't want to devolve into something that turns into something else that has never turned out very well. And the willingness to absolve the individual responsibility, right? The individual, like, you have a choice. I'm not saying that it's a good choice. I'm not even going to go down that road first. It's the fact that you have a choice. Okay, well, can I work two jobs? Look, my wife and I'll give you a great example personally, anecdotally. We have that other house that we didn't need to sell. We're here. And guess what? My wife has been a stay at home mom the entire time. So my oldest daughter is 13. She's been a stay at home mom the entire time, mainly because we personally came together and made the decisions to sacrifice this or that or whatever so that we could have that specific scenario. If I had to work two jobs, three jobs, that's what I would do because that's what's important to us. But that's an individual choice, selection. I don't want to discount the selection of the individual. I'm just saying that, from a economic perspective, we could always do better. And if we don't have these conversations, more and more people are allowed to come along with, I'll say, nonsense, quite frankly, and interject nonsense into the discussion because there's a vacuum. There's a void there. We're not actively discussing on how we can create something better, on how we can, quite frankly, regulate something better or, reinforce what we already have. And nonsense is allowed into the vacuum. And quite frankly, nuanced, I don't want to say nuanced nonsense, but that's kind of what it is. Because when you dismiss the individual in our current choice, yes, could things be better? Yes. But you can't outright dismiss the individual and say everything is a social construct and all this other nonsense because it takes away from the real problems that we have. And that's just as much of an issue as not talking about what we've got going on over here from a real theory-based capitalism that's put in society where we worship capital.
Sometimes you can make decisions that don't best serve you, but without knowing that they're not going to best serve you because you've been led to believe not necessarily through any one ideology, but just through common practices, that those decisions are in your best interests. And and you're right that those conversations can be painful, but because if we live in a vacuum, we don't realize what's happening outside of us. But something that people may not be aware of, if they do subscribe purely to the sociological explanation of how the world works, is me as a counsellor, I work with people who have suffered some absolutely horrific things, including pretty severe emotional trauma and abuse. And part of sociological explanations of how the world works suggests that trauma results from oppressive systems. Now, to a certain extent, that does happen, because if the system allows abusers not to suffer consequences, then their behaviors are going to continue. But at the same time, what often happens in trauma, and I'm saying this not just as a counsellor, but as someone who experienced it himself and has a number of mental illnesses that I've had to battle over the years to get to where I am now, when we are mentally troubled, we inadvertently enact behaviors that our feelings say are going to help us, but in reality don't actually contribute to the situation. They cause further harm and further bring us away from our goals. And one of the most difficult conversations to have with a client is to say, first of all, explain how that process works in a manner that's not going to be lacking in compassion or empathy, and honoring that it's not their fault that what happened, but also helping them to realize what decisions they can make, what decisions they can make that can contribute to the situation. It's not to say they caused the problem, or that somebody else didn't do something that was horrible and that they shouldn't be allowed to do it, but more that because we can't control what happened in the past and we can't control other people's choices, if you refuse to take control, you're going to continue the cycle of suffering. If you do take control, it's not to say that your suffering is going to end, but the situation will be better. And another thing that has to be made clear, it's not to say that we shouldn't improve aspects of our society, like how we educate people to recognize the signs of abuse and making sure that the criminal justice system does its job so that abusers face justice. We should still improve those as much as we can, but in the immediate realm of what can I do about how my mind is troubling me in this lifetime, without personal action, the results aren't likely to be good. So it's important that we do understand what choices we have, but as you say, also knowing where the boundary is and not getting to the point of feeling as though that we have to make every choice on our own. Unfortunately, that can also be a product of trauma, thinking that you must be 100% independent, otherwise there is something wrong with you. And some people also suffer mentally as a result of that when they try to do more than what is actually reasonably capable within their capabilities. There's something else that you mentioned that's important. It's to do with how there could be a slippery slope into regulation when we allow too much of it to happen. First of all, does every capitalist genuinely believe in a lack of regulation? There's something that came to mind when I thought of that, and that is we don't have a direct analog here in Australia, or at least not in Victoria, but I understand in the United States there are homeowners associations. Um, Something that I find is associated with capitalist culture, or at least conservative capitalist culture, we could say. But I've, I don't want to pin it on that, because as I've analysed before, both major political ideologies effectively have the same types of cognitive flaws, just directed towards different subjects. So it's not exclusively the issue of right-wing politics, but as an example of where capitalism may not be implemented as it's intended or how it's proclaimed to be, you might have people who do agree with the concept of a homeowners association, and perhaps somebody in a homeowners association obviously owns their own property and might want to fly an LGBT flag in the front yard of their house. And someone might say, well, we don't agree with it, therefore we should have the right to tell you to take it down. And that person might have just been complaining on social media just recently that their religious freedoms are being oppressed, or that their freedoms as a homeowner are being oppressed, or that, they have a right to own property. And the question is, well, you have the right to own property and you've bought it and you get to control it because your hard work and sacrifice allowed you to make the money to buy it. Why shouldn't the person who bought their own property and did the same be allowed to place their flag in the ground? You may not agree with it, and it should be your right not to agree with it, but where do your rights end and that person's rights start? and why should the rights be afforded to you but not that other person? And why is there an inconsistency in the argument? And they will make excuses. I mean, every person who finds that somebody else is using their own logic against them or a large number of people who are very ideologically minded will try to make excuses as to why those rules apply to thee but not for me. But it's something that needs to be asked. We need to apply those rules consistently. If somebody else has to make a sacrifice, then yes, so should you. If you don't want to have to make the sacrifice, then why should somebody else?
Yeah, I would note that there's a lot of inconsistencies in that thinking, right? Those same individuals, from a capitalist perspective, and again, we seem to be dumping on capitalism, but we're not. We're just pointing out some inconsistencies that definitely need to be addressed, in my perspective. But from a theme, a lot of those individuals at the HOA are probably very anti-government regulation, and yet they turn right around and impose regulations on individuals. And so it's very inconsistent.
There's one final point that needs to be made with regards to the benefits of the more free market. I won't say the entirely free market, but the more free market as opposed to a very heavily regulated market. And it's that with too much regulation comes less incentive to start a business, hire people, and then allow other people to profit from it. A good example that I discussed with someone some time ago is not to say that there should be discrimination in hiring or that discrimination in hiring is a good thing, but if you impose too many restrictions on a business that involve it paying more compliance fees, which can happen under socialism, or meeting more requirements, which means the business owner has to take more time away from their work, which means that costs them money in the form of time, or there are requirements in terms of hiring that have to be met that are arduous, or that means that the business owner, if you live in a jurisdiction in which affirmative action is actually a legislated requirement, has to hire someone based on their identity rather than their pure competence to complete the work. To be honest, I don't know of any jurisdiction in which that is actually a legislated requirement, so I don't want to fuel the fire of anti-socialist fear mongering by saying, oh, they're going to take your jobs, because I don't actually know if there is any jurisdiction in which it is legislated to have to hire someone based on identity. If anyone out there knows of one, please feel free to contribute it, but I don't know of any. But in theory, if you did that, the business owner can say, okay, if I run a business, I have to pay these fees. I have to hire people on these bases. I have to meet these arduous requirements. I know what I'll do. I just won't run a business here, or I won't hire people, which means that the economy doesn't benefit from whatever that business owner has to contribute. Other members of the economy, which could benefit from that, what that business owner has to contribute, don't benefit from it. Potential staff who could have, wonderful careers at that business don't get to have that. And the business owner saying, well, I'd like to, but I can't afford what these legislative requirements demand of me. So I can't be expected to both run a business and live at a sacrifice, because then who's going to look after me? I can only look after myself. And companies, from what I've heard from certain analysts, if the Australian economy in its current dire state continues moving the way it does, where it is expensive to run a business, some companies may well say, we can't afford to run a business here. We're going to operate overseas instead. There goes people's jobs, and then even more people are financially worse off. Did the regulation help it? Well, it's not to say that regulation wasn't necessary, but it was probably poorly implemented and it had unintended consequences. And then where does innovation come from if people aren't incentivized to take that risk? If they know in advance that if they take the risk, there's less likely to be any return for them.
That's 100% true. And it is, again, that is certainly an issue and a problematic one that can happen. And quite frankly, there was some, let's say, rumblings that you could kind of see in America anyway, that it was leaning towards that direction. But what it is it's an overcorrection to abuses of a system that, we need to have that balance with the individual and societal perspective. I'm not saying that we should just be rabidly individual, but I'm also not saying that we should be, rabidly the collective either. Most of us, I think, probably reside somewhere in the middle, and that's where our economic model, especially from a governance perspective, needs to fully fit. And that's an issue that it's an ongoing conversation, but it's a conversation that is lamentable because we don't have it. We don't have it enough. We result to empty platitudes. We result to the propaganda that we've been fed, to the specific positions that we seem to. This is a hill that I'm gonna die on, even though I can't accurately explain why it is. This is what our economic policy debate has been rendered to, unfortunately. So that is a problem. And for those individuals who are, let's say, pro, like anti-capitalism, I'll say that way. Those individuals who are anti-capitalist have to understand that that is a very serious problem. But for those who are rabid capitalist, also need to understand this is the danger of not having the ongoing conversations about how we can continue to serve not just our own specific interest or the business, but also society at large. Because as Peter Drucker said, what's the purpose of a business? Is to create a customer. That's it. Is to create a customer. And you're not going to create any customers, or you're going to create fewer customers if you're not interested in the collective at all.
Absolutely. And with those observations, let's give some credence to socialistic ideas. There are certain ideas from socialism that, when implemented, are not only have the potential to be very effective economically, but also can allow for the nurturance of the human race. Now, one of the most important points that you mentioned about extreme capitalism is that it can be very, as they say, dog eat dog, where capital as the final end game rather than a means to an end is worshipped and considered some kind of high good. Now, again, first of all, nature didn't invent money, we did. So even though it has become a manufactured need because it has become ingrained into our human nature across countless generations, so it's not evil to want to earn capital in order to survive in the environment in which you find yourself. To worship it as some kind of natural good is also problematic because humans have greater virtue than what a pure consideration of money allows for. Love for one another that can't be bought with money, consideration for the actual products and services that we provide to the end consumer. The consumer's paying the money as a proxy, but the actual benefits are completely separate. They're something that go beyond what you pay for them. And at the same time, again, the theory that if you are disadvantaged by some means that you didn't try hard enough, it's a complete fallacy. As you said, we don't know often what sort of arduous hardships other people had to endure just to make themselves a meager living. And it's all well and good for a person who is privileged to say, well, they didn't try hard enough. But uh, just because some people are malingering, it doesn't mean most people are malingering. It doesn't mean all people are malingering. And someone who is genuinely trying their best but can't find stability shouldn't be made to suffer because some other people are trying to take advantage of the system, especially in places like Australia where we do have social welfare systems and socialised healthcare. And I've worked with what we call the National Disability Insurance Scheme, or NDIS, which provides funding for services to individuals with psychological or physical disabilities. There are people who take advantage of it and use it in a dishonest way, both providers and clients. But there are also clients who could benefit massively from services there that may not be able to get the full extent of services because the system doesn't see them as being suited to having that funding. And the question is, well, hang on, if that person fails despite everything that they've tried, and the actual implied answer that we're giving to that problem is, well, better luck next time, nature selected you, sorry pal, off you go, out of the gene pool, then what precedent is that setting that we can effectively just live a life based on consideration of ourselves and no one else? The question you always have to ask when you set a precedent is, what happens when it extends or people extrapolate from it? What happens if you don't set a hard standard? quite frankly, we could, as you so we could devolve into a society in which we don't care about others and we are greatly willing to sacrifice others as the result of our own selfish desires, which then will result in everyone disadvantaging because eventually there's going to be someone stronger than us who steps on us. There goes our social cohesion.
That's precisely it. That's the human nature of it, right? Is the human nature is we're so I take a biblical frame view, and I think that we have a very difficult problem of evil, if you will. I think socialism allows for the benefits there are, which it allows from a governmental control perspective. It allows individuals, someone's going to exploit the system, however it works out, and it allows individuals to come in and break that social compact, the social cohesion, and to rule it, which is, from an individual perspective, I'm very much in favor of, you know, touching back on something you said earlier when it came to individual personal responsibility and getting over on people. When you have a law, going back to business or whatever, if the punishment doesn't fit the crime, you're incentivizing that crime to be repeated, is what you're doing. If it isn't punishable enough to where it actually affects people to the degree that they begin to think, well, maybe I shouldn't do that again, then you're incentivizing that behavior over again. So from a collective perspective, then companies that, routinely break, whether it's US law or Australian labor law, the fines and the punishment need to be hefty enough to where people are like, I shouldn't want to, corporations in general too. I don't want to do that, whether it's child exploitation or, violating child labor laws or hiding behind some corporate anonymity, holding individuals and the collective responsible when it comes to abuses, whether it's in the gaming the system or not. Those individuals that you're talking about, is it NDIS? I think you said those individuals, whether they're doing that or over here stateside, are abusing welfare. They're not held accountable. So you know what you're doing? You're incentivizing those individuals to continue to do it. And you're incentivizing new individuals to come in and continue to game and exploit the system.
There seems to be a common talking point from a libertarian perspective that, well, if you can't make it on your own, there's always some private charity or someone willing to help. I don't know how it is in the United States, and I don't have a lot of insight into the statistics about charities in Australia, but would you say that there is enough private charity to go around? Because my question always is, if you're having to pay for yourself under a pure capitalist system, can you afford to donate to a charity? Because charity's not going to get it from the government, so they have to get it from well-meaning citizens.
I would say no. I would say so. We give to numerous ministries, in from a family perspective. But what that thought process, what that does is you're actually to me anyway, the way I hear it, what you do when you operate from that frame of mind is that you incentivize more abuse in the economic system because, well, who cares? We got charities that'll pick up the system, and this is one of the things that I think is very indicative of the system in general is that we are overloaded in the social networks, in the social framework, the social safety nets. We're overloaded. Why are we overloaded? I like charities. Everywhere you drive in my area, you have signs that say, "Do not encourage panhandling." There are, the city and various institutions are part of the problem to try to help people, right? And you have to kind of divide through, okay, well, how many of these individuals are, willingly try to game individuals, and how many of them have real mental health problems? And that's one of the reasons why they're out there panhandling. And so trying to navigate that can be very sticky and very troublesome for some people, and I understand that. So I'm all for charities. But when you start to think in that frame of reference of, well, if you just fall, there's always going to be a safety social net there. Part of that was intended to incentivize entrepreneurship, but it can also create an overdependency and allow exploitation within the current economic model. So again, everything is in the balance. Everything is in the balance.
Absolutely, and that's an example of how the intentions of a particular arrangement or a system may not actualize the benefits that were intended and may actually end up working against themselves. There's another way that capitalism, when it's taken too literally, can do that. And I'm going to say I'm not an economist, so my extent of knowledge on economic forces is not what yours would be or what someone else's would be. But something that my father always taught me, which he was a businessman, said if you live in excess, eventually those habits will come back to bite you, and it will come back to bite society as well. And what, as my understanding, what tends to happen is if wealth becomes the end game rather than just a means to better life, what ends up happening is people, as you say, see no reason to not pursue as much of it as possible. When they pursue too much of it, phenomena such as inflation take place, if I'm not misinterpreting that theory, in which if you earn more wealth but the productivity doesn't increase to match how much is being distributed in terms of wealth, then the dollar becomes inflated. There's not enough being exported in terms of products and services, both domestically and internationally, in order to justify how much is being spent. Products and services become more expensive. It becomes more expensive to operate an enterprise. It becomes more expensive to live. And from that comes eventual poverty. And what can also happen is when socialism and capitalism are in the wrong balance, where they combine in the wrong way, it essentially assigns too much of a monetary value to something that has no inherent worth. A good example of this is in social services, at least in Australia, under the NDIS in which I've worked. Under the NDIS, the money distributed to clients to be able to pay for their care services is from the government, so it's socialised. But the providers who provide the services and the products are private businesses. Now, there are some regulations about how much those businesses can charge, but there are also instances in which there are no regulation and they can charge as much as they want. There's not necessarily oversight in all the places where there should be. And what often happens is there are also requirements by the government that end up requiring a lot of that funding to be spent on something that has a lot of work involved, but not necessarily the maximum tangible outcome for the client. I'll give you an example. Often, in order to justify why certain funding and services are required, clients need evidence from health professionals. Now, if they already have a plan and their plan isn't meeting their requirements, they can spend their money to pay health professionals to write justifying reports. One of the most common is from an occupational therapist called a functional capacity assessment, where they assess every aspect of the client's life. They examine what they can do and what they can't do, and then they make recommendations for what services they may need. Now, again, I'm not denying the worth of a good health professional. They're invaluable. We bless them. We couldn't live without them. But the amount of detail that's needed in them, that's often demanded by the system and their own regulatory bodies, I'm assuming, possibly, those reports can take 8 to 10 hours to write in total, including assessments and writing. And the limit for occupational therapy under the NDIS as of now is $193.99 Australian currency. That means that those reports could easily be costing close to $2,000, if not more, to write. Now, the problem is when it goes to the assessor at the NDIS, do they actually read them? Plenty of people's experiences, including my own, suggest that they don't. So all that money has been spent on something that ultimately doesn't have the intended effect, and the client doesn't even get to feel the benefits of that until an assessor decides, okay, I've read this report, I can see that you have a need for this, I'm going to grant you the funding so that you can get these services, so that you can hopefully get better or lead a better life. All that money being spent when the occupational therapist could have probably looked at the person right from the get-go if they're skilled enough and say, okay, I see what you need. It'll take me 5 minutes to write a recommendation letter. Wouldn't have cost that much, and we would have come to a tangible outcome sooner with less money being spent. But we assign the worth to it when it doesn't actually have objective worth. Objective worth is the person being healthier. A piece of paper with words on it doesn't have any more objective worth than what the outcome is of somebody using it. So if you're encouraging overspending through that, again, not through the fault of the therapist themselves, but through the system that we've encouraged, if you pursue as much of that as possible, but you don't consider what is actually the outcome of it, the value of everything goes up, but what it actually does for us as a human race doesn't. If that's my layman's understanding of economics.
Well, I think first off, I want to go back to something you said your dad said: living in excess will catch up with you. I find that as a business person, it's a very refreshing perspective because not a lot of people have that thought behind what it is. And secondly, the finances or the acquisition of wealth has indeed become the end, not the means to an end, but the actual end. And it does cause some significant problems. And this gaming the system, if you will, of where I'm going to try to make as much money as possible, so I'll work within what should be a it's a socialistic idea, social services, right? So I'm gonna exploit that too, and I'm really just gaming the system to try to make as much money as possible. And then, quite frankly, we end up seeing what we're talking about, which is the end user ultimately just gets disenfranchised to a significant degree, and the quality of care ends up going down. It's not necessarily because of incompetence, as you say. It's because of let's say a system that's being exploited. I'm incentivized to take as much time as possible because I'm getting paid to do it. The system is getting paid to do whatever it happens to be doing, and so I'm not incentivized to provide high quality care in this in where I could just sit here and look at this person and say that's the case. This person needs this help. Yep, sure. Red stamp. Go about our business. And I think a lot of this has to do with us as individuals, what economic model that we work under, but also what our perceived, um, let's say, our perceived morality goes into as well. You know, am I quite comfortable gaming the system? Am I quite comfortable exploiting another human being? Well, if I am, then everything is a means to an end. Or everything is to a means to an end, which is the acquisition of capital. And I don't care who have to step on or who have to exploit, going forward. And there's something else that prompted me to think about this idea of finances and thinking long term. And there's shareholder shareholder value where they really only think about the next quarter. That's it. There is no like long term thought process. There is no thought process about how we can serve other people. It's all about how much money can I make. And the problem with that, of course, is that there's a lot of people who are ran over in the economic calculus. It's one dimensional, going back to what I said at the beginning. And so this idea that unfortunately these socialistic concepts that we do come up with and we are able to implement to some degree into society, firefighters and police are another couple. They're also, weaponized or eroded for the purpose of, again, trying to make as much capital as possible. Labor be damned.
There can be something of a myth about capitalism that it facilitates freedom. Now, whether that's true or not depends on how you define freedom, as simple as it may sound. Yes, you may have the freedom to run a business or walk away from a business transaction if you don't agree with it. The problem is that even though authoritarian control may be less under a capitalist system, psychological control is still there. I'm not saying it doesn't exist under socialism, because it does, but there is a form of psychological control. I thought recently a lot of people are angry about the service that they receive from big corporations. Generally speaking, if someone likes a business, it's usually a smaller business that provides very personalized service where the owner's quite humble and honest, and they're actually considering the quality of their service to their end customers and their clients, and often they can justify charging more on that basis because they're providing personalized service and their services are worth it. But my question then is, so how do the big corporations become so successful and become market leaders in their respective fields if everyone is so angry and pretty much is in consensus that you don't get particularly good service from them? And then I thought, well, there's a possible explanation for that. If you live in a free market, you're responsible for yourself. Looking after yourself takes effort. That takes mental, not just physical effort, but mental effort. If you have to spend that effort on looking after yourself just to earn a living, you're probably going to try to save effort in other ways as well. That means if you need something that can only be purchased with money, you need a quick answer of where can I go to get this product or service. The bigger businesses have more money to share in order to, that they have more money to be able to pay for marketing. They have more money to be able to pay for persuasive marketing. Because most people, as I said, aren't taught practical psychology, they don't know how advertising affects them, which means that they are more likely to fall subject to it. They're more likely to be persuaded. Smaller businesses offer the better service, but they don't have the money to pay for that type of persuasion. So people take the convenient option so they can get back to their lives leading that rat race. And we continue to complain, yeah, big corporates, they never give us good service. But how many people ask, what are the alternatives? How many people have time to research the alternatives? And that could be one of the ways that capitalism is exerts that type of psychological control. Yes, you have the freedom to run a business. Yes, you have the freedom to voluntarily enter or exit business transactions. But if you don't know any better, or if you are so pressed for resources that you genuinely think that saving time is the only way for you to be able to survive, you're going to take whatever options are available. And if everyone thinks that way, the illusion self perpetuates. And people think, well, we have infinite choices. Yes, we do have a lot of choice, but people just don't realize just how powerfully their minds play on them. They don't realize you often think and act in ways, and you're not even aware of the motivations, or you're not even aware of how the world is acting on you. Once you become aware of that, yes, you're very powerful, but before then, you can be quite vulnerable. And it self perpetuates, and the so called freedom effectively becomes irrelevant when the control is perpetuated by us.
That's 100% true. Not only does it resonate with me, but you're absolutely right. We've had we've had a race to the bottom in a lot of ways, and it's been very devastating to a lot of degrees. And so you have to have individuals that stand on principle to some degree. And what you're dancing around is the collective group of people have way more power than they realize. And so we're divided. We're, left wing, right wing in America, two wings of the same bird. They're really here to divide you so that you don't focus on what I'll say are the more prevalent and the more important discussions when it comes to, the collective body of people. And it could be the same for anything that they thought was wrong. It could be the same way for anything. If there was and I'll just make this up, but if there was a company that was just that has a long laundry list of, not necessarily putting 9-year-olds to work, but had child violations, and it got out, and a whole host of people said, we're going to boycott this particular company. Guess what they're going to do? They're going to listen to the collective voice, or there's the very real possibility to go out of business. Do all capitalists not want as least regulation as possible? No, there are some who I would say are they're more skewed to the responsible nature than others. I think if you follow, capitalists and corporations have no social responsibility except to make profit. Well, then what that really means is that I can do as much damage to the environment as possible. And if left to its devices, you would have, you'd have smog like you wouldn't believe anywhere else. You would have no navigable waterways that are actually worth anything. We have these gigantic sequoia trees out in California that are massive. You wouldn't have a single one left standing if it wasn't for governmental protection from, allowing the community, the citizenry, the entire populace to go out and see these, behemoths. So again, there's that balance, but you do have individuals who are a little bit more, let's say, admonishing. They understand the need for regulation. It's just a matter of, okay, now we're on the spectrum. So where at on this spectrum do we find ourselves? The vast majority of individuals, because it doesn't benefit them or it costs them money, they don't want a regulation. They want as few as possible. I'm not in favor for that because you you don't if you follow it to to the degree that it is, there's corporations have power and a lot of those individuals have a lot of money. And so what they do then is that you've got and there are numerous examples, at least in America. You've got places like Anniston, Alabama, where you've got a lot of environmental pollution. This is what happens when you don't have an EPA to be there, or you don't have, I don't know what if you guys have a a sister organization that we have, OSHA, where it's very safety minded from the individual. There's still political individuals to this day who are trying to abolish OSHA. Blows my mind because they don't, so there are individuals. It's just a matter of where they fall on the spectrum. And I'm grateful, and they need to be frank with you. They need to have a bigger microphone than they have, because they need to drag other people along and say, no, we need responsible regulation. But what is the definition of that? And if the pendulum swings to the degree to where we revolt against any revolution, it comes back with a hefty hammer and swings back with momentum to crushing. It can do that. And the problem with that is that if you don't have a seat at the table, then it might be a regulation that nobody likes, but you didn't have any buy-in because you were so clearly focused on making the absolute bottom dollar, to the exclusion of the environment, to human resources, to all of these things that I could sit here and check boxes off. And now we're in a predicament where we could have systemic and serious issues. Uh, I wish we had more discussion on this. There actually is no such thing as a free market. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist at all. And anybody that uses that terminology is being disingenuous at best. At worst, they're actively trying to deceive and propagandize to get their specific agenda forwarded. And if people really understood that there was no such thing as a free market, and maybe they might be thinking about, well, if there is no such thing as the free market, what kind of market do we have? And what kind of economic model are we working under today? Or, as have said several times, what kind of economic model are we are we propping up as opposed to working for us? I'll also note that one of the basic tenets of capitalism, at least how it's operated here, is that you'll hear people talk about, choice and, competition, competition, until it comes to competing for labor. And then we don't want competition, because competition then drives up the amount that you're going to have to pay individuals for labor. We don't want that. So there's that inconsistency as well, a glaring inconsistency, but we don't talk about that because I am reminded of the Roman satirist Juvenal. Give the people bread and circuses and they won't revolt. So if you feed them and you entertain them, I can distract them. And they won't, sit here and pay a lot of, homage to what we've got going on, or the glaring inconsistencies with, we talk about competition, but I don't want to compete over labor. That's a glaring inconsistency, if you ask me. So if there's some serious fatal flaws that I think you said people justify for thee, but not for me kind of stuff. And it's unfortunate because I really do wish that more people were talking about this, but I almost feel like in a large degree, it's intentional to not. We don't want to talk about this. We want to keep the train rolling to the direction it's going, to the speed that it's going, and to what end. And I'm very, very, very pro union. So just a really quick explanation into the unionism versus non-union. Unionism is a collection of individuals who come together and they collectively bargain for better wages, for better job site security, et cetera. And here in America, I'm not sure how it is in Australia, but here in America, it's amazing to me that the vast majority of things that you interview with, house payment, rent, car insurance, all of these things are underneath the contract, except work. Work is not under a contract. And I think that's intentionally designed that way. And so what unions do effectively is it's a collective group of people that come together. And so from that perspective, right, when I begin to do a lot of research and look into it, I see that a rising tide lifts all boats. But I've seen unionism in America erode. And it's not because of lack of interest. We call that the representation gap. There's a representation gap of individuals who would like to be represented by unionism but are not. And you see like this deliberate class struggle almost to a significant degree that really started to kick off with a lot of heat during COVID. And it's continually gaining momentum. Quite frankly, it's not forced on you. I think you should want to be a union member because you should want to come together and exercise the collective nature of people coming together going enough is enough. It's exactly, and everything that we've had is a fight for the 40-hour work week, a fight for no weekends, a fight for OSHA, a fight for no child labor. Every single thing was a fight. But guess what? It was the collective fight. And as we're this rabid individualistic, nature that has been, it's good in a lot of ways. I don't want to, denounce it, but we have to have this balance of the collective too, so that we could come together and exert that power against those rabid individuals who have enormous amounts of money and enormous amounts of influence, to the benefit of them and not necessarily to the benefit of society in general. And it does resonate with me way more than and we have to have enough individuals who are willing to stand on principle and come together and work together and come from commonality. But it starts with getting the word out. There's a whole lot of people who aren't willing to go through the motions of, let's say, bypassing gatekeeping, the various gatekeeping that exists today, and it's changed, but bypassing the gatekeeping to get the actual information that I need to make an informed and collective decision, as opposed to, I'm just so distracted with nonsense that I don't even think about the realities of all the things that are so important today that are swept under the rug because I've got a cell phone in my hand and I'm watching YouTube and TikTok shorts for hours on end, distracting myself, then as opposed to facing the reality of whatever situation that we've got, that we really need to address.
Absolutely perfectly said. You made another point earlier that really speaks to this sense of self-perpetuation of the market and how people do have a collective power to change how the market operates through their own choices and acting for the better. You mentioned that markets don't tend to create or don't tend to solve the problems that they create, which often does happen. There's also instances in which, though, that it's arguable that markets can create problems in order to solve them. As the old saying says, the person who sells you the disease then sells you the cure. Self-perpetuation, I find, again, I'm not, I don't want to be ignorant of economics, and also, I don't want to deny the fact that a lot of wealthy business people started poor and had to work and make incredible sacrifices in order to get rich. Is there a possibility that wealth self-perpetuates? For example, when you have enough money to invest in a variety of different sources, because the value of those sources is constantly growing, even if it's only a minor growth, if there's enough money invested in them, that growth in actuality for you as an individual in terms of what that could bring to you if it was liquidated can be quite significant, especially compared to what the average person might earn. And there's only so much wealth to go around. As they say, you can't simply print more money. If wealth was really infinite, we would just print more money and solve the world's poverty, but it doesn't really work that way, because that then modifies the entire of society's behavior, so that the value that we assign to that wealth then becomes less, and it becomes less effective of doing what we want it to do. But if there is a certain amount of wealth, then we could say that it's possible to hoard it, because even though, yes, a rich person literally can fail and can become bankrupt in legal terms, is it true that there are perhaps legal protections that mean that they can still keep their wealth in other forms, that then they could then legally liquidate and not end up poor?
It's funny that you bring this up because I was researching earlier, but from 1990 to 2024, so in the span of 34 years, I was looking at generational wealth and who holds what. And so back in 1990, it was like a bell curve. So as you're young, well, as you would expect, as you're young, you have less wealth because you're accumulating things as you're working. And then as you hit that stride, maybe mid 30s to late mid 30s to early 40s, you're starting to climb on that bell curve. And then when you hit retirement, what you start to see is obviously it going down, because you're using that which you have saved up, that which you have accumulated to then sustain you through retirement. Fast forward to 2024 when this analysis was done, and what you find is that there's a enormous seismic shift in wealth that's being held by older people. Uh, and it's amazing. It's like 70% of all wealth is held by those who are 55 and older. So that bell curve then doesn't go from where I'm young and I'm hitting my stride and I'm coming down, and at the retirement end doesn't go down because because somehow the boomer generation has been either it was perpetuated by them to this degree, or they just happen to be the recipients of it, where we've shifted from a earned income as being the thing that is the metric to that which is invested. And so, that and there's a whole lot. There's way more than what I want to detail within this podcast of what I'll say is a a shift of wealth upwards to them from a lot of youth with the housing market and inflated assets, as well as student loan debt. That's enormous amounts of money that makes younger people economic slaves, at least in America. But it was very interesting that this wealth perpetuation is, I believe, the idea that you were iterating on. And so now all of their wealth seems to be in a lot of investments from assets and net worth. And so now a lot of baby boomers, for example, might have started accumulating wealth in their 30s and 40s when it was a whole lot different and a lot easier in America to buy a home. And through what I'll say is artificially inflated assets, that bell curve doesn't just quite come down. It continues and perpetuates through older age. And it's fascinating to postulate why that has been the case. For me, I think it's been intentional in numerous ways. These individuals, baby boomers in general, older folks today, they were the ones who ran a lot of what I'll consider predatory loan agencies that are siphoning a lot of wealth, a continual siphoning from the youth to pay these, high interest rate loans that you cannot claim bankruptcy on here in America, as well as artificially inflating. The statistic bears out. It was like housing prices in 30 years have 34 years have gone up over 400%, and yet wages have gone up less than 200%. And so the logical question is, why is this the case? What is it that makes, in the case of housing, what is it that makes them worth the 400 other than a consent by the ones who hold it saying, yeah, it's worth that much? What is it that makes it that much worth it? And then, quite frankly, to tie it back to the capitalist perspective, it- there. Quite frankly, they're following that model. They don't have any social responsibility either, except to make as much money as possible. So I don't really care about the social compact at that point, which is where we're having social cohesion erosion. This is an extremely nuanced topic.
Yeah.
You honestly could do a mini series or a continual discussion on some of these topics, and I'd like to also point out that we have been talking about a lot of low hanging fruit, but also about very nuanced discussions that are far more valuable than low hanging fruit. I don't like to talk about low hanging fruit all that much because that's what simple people talk about. I mean, I'm not, I'm not trying to be derogatory, but what I am saying is that it's very easy to point the finger at low hanging fruit and say, that's the problem right there, when it's so much more complicated than that. But sometimes we have to talk about some of the lower hanging fruit to move up the tree and get deeper into some of the issues that we've got going on. And I think that as this is why I'm very, let's say, bullish on podcasts, because it affords people an opportunity to do research and to have nuanced conversations that then allow, these detailed perspectives out further into the populace. So I'm very bullish on podcasts, and hopefully a lot more people will begin to contemplate and not be as distracted with things that in the end really don't matter at all.
Well said, Rusty. Well said. And part of the virtue of what we're doing in our occupations here is not just as an end, but as a means to an end, because every
Yeah.
conversation that we create then provides a platform for further conversation, further discussion, further exploration, further discovery.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Rossi, this has been a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm sure that our listeners will not only be informed by it, but also inspired to conduct their own research and make further contemplations about the nuances of these issues. And to our listeners, thank you to everyone for joining us. Just a reminder that if you have concerns about yourself or someone else of any description, please do not take what you find on the internet or in the media as advice. Seek advice from a professional, someone else you trust. And if you're inspired, if you have feedback, we would love to hear from you. Our details will be in the description of this episode. And until next time, everyone, take care of yourselves.